Sometimes the hardest thing about being unwanted is pretending you don't care. Sometimes the loneliest moment is when you realize no one is coming to save you. 16-year-old Meredith stands on a stranger's porch in 1880s Montana, sold by her own father to a man who never came to claim her. She has nowhere to go and no one who wants her. Rancher Gabriel Ashford finds her there with his 7-year-old daughter Annabelle. Gabriel lost his wife when Annabelle was born and has been raising her alone ever since. Meredith stays to help with chores, and for 3 days they share quiet meals together. Then one evening, as Meredith tucks the little girl into bed, Annabelle reaches for her hand. In a soft whisper that changes everything, she asks, "Will you be our mother?" What happens when 3 broken hearts find exactly what they need in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the weathered porch where Meredith had spent her first night as an unwanted bride. The crumpled marriage contract lay beside her worn carpet bag, its ink smeared from tears she'd tried so hard not to shed. At 16, she had learned that survival meant swallowing your pride and accepting whatever hand life dealt you. But this felt different. This felt like the end of everything she had ever hoped for. Gabriel Ashford emerged from the modest ranch house, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden planks. He was a man carved from the frontier itself, tall and lean, with hands that spoke of honest work and eyes that held depths of sorrow she recognized. His dark hair showed traces of silver at the temples, though he couldn't have been more than 35. When he looked at her, there was no judgment in his gaze, only a quiet understanding that made her chest tight with unexpected emotion. "You don't have to sleep out here," he said, his voice gentle as morning wind through prairie grass. "We've got a spare room. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry." Meredith pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I don't want to be a burden. My father said, 'Your father isn't here.'" Gabriel's tone remained steady, but something hardened in his expression. "And the man who was supposed to claim you hasn't shown his face. Far as I'm concerned, that contract isn't worth the paper it's written on." Behind him, the door creaked open, and a small figure appeared. Annabelle Ashford was 7 years old, with her father's serious eyes and hair the color of wheat in summer. She wore a simple blue dress, carefully mended in places, and regarded Meredith with the kind of solemn curiosity that children possess when they sense something important is happening. "Papa, is she staying?" Annabelle asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Gabriel's expression softened as he looked at his daughter. "That's up to her, little bird. She can stay as long as she needs to." Meredith felt something crack open inside her chest, a tiny fissure in the wall she had built around her heart. "I can work," she said quickly. "I'm good with cooking and cleaning. I can earn my keep." "I'm sure you can," Gabriel replied. "But first, let's get you some breakfast." "You look like you haven't eaten properly in days." He wasn't wrong. The journey from her father's failing farm had been 3 days of riding in the back of a supply wagon, surviving on hardtack and whatever water the driver was willing to share. Her stomach had been clenched with hunger and fear for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be truly hungry versus simply afraid. The inside of the Ashford home was simple, but well-maintained. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace that provided warmth and a sturdy wooden table that had seen years of family meals. Wildflowers in a mason jar sat in the center, and Meredith realized that Annabelle must have picked them. It was a small touch, but it spoke of a home where someone still cared about beauty, even in hard times. Gabriel moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, starting coffee and pulling ingredients from well-organized shelves. Meredith watched, noting how he knew exactly where everything belonged, how he measured flour and salt with the confidence of a man who had been cooking for his family for years. When he caught her watching, he smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. "Lost my wife when Annabelle was born," he said simply, as if answering a question she hadn't asked. "Had to learn to cook, or we both would have starved." "I'm sorry," Meredith whispered, and meant it. She knew what loss felt like, though hers had come differently. Her mother had died when she was 12, leaving her to care for her father as his drinking grew worse, and the farm fell deeper into debt. It was a long time ago, Gabriel said, though his voice carried the kind of weight that suggested some wounds never fully healed. Annabelle's been the light of my life ever since. The little girl in question had settled at the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching Meredith with those serious eyes. "Are you going to have a baby?" she asked suddenly. "Annabelle," Gabriel said gently, but Meredith saw him tense. "It's all right," Meredith said, though her cheeks burned. "No, sweetheart. I'm not married. But Papa said you were supposed to be." The innocence of the question cut deep. How could she explain to a 7-year-old that sometimes fathers sold their daughters like livestock when the bills came due? How could she make a child understand that love and marriage were luxuries some people couldn't afford? "Sometimes grown-up arrangements don't work out the way people plan," she said carefully. "Your father is being very kind, letting me stay here until I figure out what to do next." Annabelle nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. "Mama used to say that God puts people where they need to be, even when it doesn't make sense right away." Gabriel's hands stilled over the skillet where bacon was beginning to sizzle. The mention of his wife seemed to affect him more than he wanted to show, and Meredith felt another crack in her carefully constructed walls. This man and his daughter were carrying their own grief, their own careful balance of survival and hope. "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman," Meredith said softly. "She was beautiful too," Annabelle continued, warming to the subject. "Papa has a picture of her. Want to see?" Before Gabriel could object, Annabelle was up and running to a wooden chest in the corner of the room. She returned with a small framed photograph, handling it with the reverence reserved for precious things. The woman in the picture had been lovely, delicate features and kind eyes, wearing a dress that had probably been her best. She looked young, maybe not much older than Meredith herself. Her name was Catherine, Gabriel said, accepting the frame from his daughter and gazing at it for a moment before setting it carefully on the table. "We were married 5 years before Annabelle came along. Kat always said she wanted a house full of children, but—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "But God only gave us me," Annabelle finished matter-of-factly. "And then he took Mama to heaven." The simple faith in the child's voice made Meredith's throat tight. She had stopped believing in God's plan the day her father told her she was worth $75 and a promise of grain through winter. But looking at this small family, seeing how they had held together despite their loss, she felt a tiny flicker of something that might have been hope. Gabriel served breakfast on mismatched plates, but the food was good, better than anything Meredith had eaten in months. The bacon was crispy, the eggs cooked perfectly, and the coffee strong enough to chase away the morning chill. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily. Gabriel asked about her journey, and she found herself telling him about the wagon ride, about sleeping under stars, and wondering if she would ever see another familiar face. She didn't tell him about her father's drinking, or about the men who had come to collect debts, or about the way her father had looked at her the morning he signed the marriage contract. Like she was a problem finally solved, rather than a daughter he was sending away forever. Annabelle chattered about the ranch, about the horses and the vegetable garden behind the house. She talked about her lessons with Miss Peterson in town, and about how her father had taught her to milk their cow, Bessie. Her excitement was infectious, and Meredith found herself smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks. After breakfast, Gabriel showed her around the property. The ranch wasn't large, but it was well maintained and clearly loved. There were a dozen head of cattle, a small herd of horses, and outbuildings that spoke of a man who took pride in his work. The vegetable garden was Annabelle's domain, though Gabriel admitted he helped with the heavier work. "It's not much," he said, surveying his domain with satisfaction. "But it's ours, free and clear. My father left it to me when he passed 10 years ago. I've been working to build it up ever since." "It's beautiful," Meredith said, and meant it. There was something peaceful about this place, something that made her chest feel less tight than it had in months. That afternoon, without being asked, she began helping with the daily chores. She fed the chickens, helped Annabelle weed the garden, and started preparing supper. Gabriel watched her work with a thoughtful expression, but he didn't try to stop her. When evening came, they sat down to another simple but satisfying meal. "You're a good cook," Gabriel said as they finished eating. "Where did you learn?" "My mother," Meredith replied. "She died when I was 12, but she taught me well before then. I've been keeping house for my father ever since." Something in her tone must have warned him not to ask more about her father, because Gabriel simply nodded. "Well, if you're planning to stay for a while, I'm grateful for the help. It's been just me and Annabelle for so long, we've gotten set in our ways." "I like our ways," Annabelle said firmly. "But I like Meredith being here too." That night, Gabriel showed Meredith to the spare room. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the prairie. On the bed lay something that made her breath catch, a simple gold wedding band resting on top of a folded quilt. "That was Catherine's," Gabriel said quietly from the doorway. "Her wedding ring. I've kept it in a wooden box all these years, but today I thought—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what I thought. Maybe that she would have wanted someone to have it. Someone who needed to know they belonged somewhere." Meredith picked up the ring with trembling fingers. It was warm from the sunlight that had streamed through the window all day, and so delicate she was afraid she might break it. "I can't take this," she whispered. "I'm not giving it to you," Gabriel said gently. "I'm asking you to hold on to it, for safekeeping, until you decide what you want to do with your life." She looked up at him, this man who had shown her more kindness in one day than she had received in years. "Why are you being so good to me?" Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Because someone should have been good to you long before now. Because my daughter hasn't smiled as much in months as she has today. And because I remember what it feels like to be lost and afraid, even if the circumstances were different." He left her alone then, closing the door softly behind him. Meredith sat on the edge of the bed, holding Catherine's ring and listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Through the thin walls, she could hear Gabriel reading to Annabelle, his deep voice gentle as he brought fairy tales to life. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Meredith fell asleep feeling safe. The next morning brought new routines. Meredith woke early and started breakfast before Gabriel and Annabelle were even stirring. She found a rhythm in the kitchen that felt natural, familiar in a way that surprised her. When they sat down to eat, Annabelle grinned at her across the table. "You make better pancakes than Papa," she announced. "Thanks a lot." "Little bird," Gabriel said with mock hurt, but he was smiling too. As the morning progressed, Meredith found herself watching the easy interaction between father and daughter with something that might have been envy. Gabriel was patient with Annabelle's questions, gentle when she made mistakes, quick to praise her efforts in the garden. This was what family looked like when it worked, when people chose to care for each other instead of seeing each other as burdens. That evening, as she helped Annabelle get ready for bed, the little girl surprised her with a question. "Are you going to stay forever?" Meredith paused in braiding the child's hair. "I don't know, sweetheart. Would you like me to stay?" "Yes," Annabelle said without hesitation. "Papa's been sad for a long time. He tries to hide it, but I know, and I've been lonely too. It's nice having someone to talk to who isn't him." The honesty in the child's voice made Meredith's chest tight. "Your father loves you very much, I know. But it's different with you. You understand girl things." Meredith finished the braid and helped Annabelle into bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin. The child looked so small in the big bed, so vulnerable, and something fierce and protective stirred in Meredith's chest. "Will you tell me a story?" Annabelle asked. So Meredith told her about princesses and dragons, about brave girls who saved kingdoms and found their true homes. As she spoke, she realized she was telling the story she hoped might be true for herself. When Annabelle's breathing deepened into sleep, Meredith sat for a moment longer, watching over this child who had already claimed a piece of her heart. Later, As she prepared to go to her own room, she found Gabriel sitting on the front porch, looking out at the star-filled sky. Without quite knowing why, she joined him, settling into the chair beside his. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For letting me stay. For treating me like I matter." Gabriel turned to look at her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "You do matter, Meredith. Don't let anyone ever tell you different." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Finally, Gabriel spoke again. "Catherine used to sit out here with me every evening," he said. "She said the stars helped her remember that our troubles were small in the grand scheme of things. Do you miss her terribly?" "Every day. But it's different now than it was right after she died. The pain isn't as sharp. And having you here, it doesn't replace what I lost, but it reminds me that there can be new kinds of happiness." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and hope. Meredith felt herself standing at a crossroads, with the familiar path of running away stretching behind her and something unknown and potentially beautiful waiting ahead. "I've never had a real family," she admitted quietly. "I don't know if I'd be any good at it." "Nobody knows until they try," Gabriel replied. "But I've watched you with Annabelle these past few days. You've got good instincts. She's already half in love with you. And you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, bold and vulnerable in the darkness. Gabriel's silence stretched long enough that she began to regret asking. Then he reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. "I'm getting there," he said simply, as they sat together under the vast Montana sky. Meredith felt something she had never experienced before, the possibility that she might truly belong somewhere, that these broken pieces of people might fit together into something whole and beautiful. It scared her almost as much as it thrilled her, but for the first time in her life, she was willing to stay and find out what might grow from hope and time, and choosing to love the people who chose to love you back. The sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful morning like gunfire. Meredith looked up from hanging laundry on the line behind the house, her hands still clutching one of Annabelle's small dresses. The rhythmic thunder of hooves on hard-packed earth sent ice through her veins. She had learned to fear the sound of men arriving unannounced. Gabriel emerged from the barn, his face grim as he counted the riders cresting the hill. 5 men riding hard and fast, dust clouds marking their approach like storm warnings. Annabelle appeared in the doorway of the house, her eyes wide with the instinctive fear children develop when they sense danger in adult voices. "Get inside," Gabriel called to both of them, but his voice carried an authority Meredith had never heard before. "Now!" But Meredith was already moving toward the house when she saw him, Vernon Cade, the man her father had sold her to like a piece of livestock. He was exactly as her father had described, thick-built and mean-eyed, with hands that looked like they knew how to hurt things. The other men flanking him had the hard, weathered look of men who lived outside the law. Cade reined in his horse just short of the porch, his gaze immediately fixing on Meredith, where she stood frozen by the laundry line. A smile spread across his face that made her stomach turn, predatory and satisfied. "There she is," he said, his voice carrying the rough edges of too much whiskey and tobacco. "My little bride. Been looking all over creation for you, girl." Gabriel stepped between them, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. The movement looked natural, but Meredith could see the tension coiled in his shoulders. "You're on my property. State your business." Cade's smile widened, showing teeth stained yellow. "My business is that girl right there. Got papers that say she belongs to me, fair and square." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, waving it like a flag of victory. "Paid her daddy $75 for her. Bill of sale, all legal and proper. People aren't property," Gabriel said quietly. But there was steel in his voice that made the horses shift nervously. "This one is." Cade's eyes never left Meredith, and she felt stripped bare under his gaze. Bought and paid for. Her daddy was real grateful too. Said she'd been nothing but a burden since her mama died. Promised me she was clean and biddable. The words hit Meredith like physical blows. She had known her father thought of her as a burden, but hearing it confirmed so casually made her legs weak. Behind Gabriel, Annabelle made a small, frightened sound. "The girl stays here," Gabriel said, his voice carrying the kind of finality that ended arguments. "Whatever agreement you had with her father, she's under my protection now." Cade laughed, a sound like gravel sliding down a hillside. "Your protection? You got no claim on her, Rancher. She's mine by law." He gestured to his men, who spread out slightly, hands drifting toward their weapons. "Now I've been patient. Tracked her all the way from Colorado, spent good money on supplies and men. I ain't leaving empty-handed." From inside her apron pocket, Meredith's fingers found the torn photograph she always carried. Half of a family portrait showing her mother's gentle face. She had torn it the day her father sold her, keeping the half with her mother and leaving the half with his image behind. Now she clutched it like a talisman, drawing strength from the memory of the one person who had ever truly loved her. "She's not going anywhere," Gabriel repeated, and something in his tone made Cade's smile falter slightly. "You got children here," Cade observed, his gaze shifting to where Annabelle peered out from behind the doorframe. Shame if something happened to upset their peaceful life. The threat hung in the air, like smoke, and Meredith saw Gabriel's entire body go rigid. She knew with the clarity that comes in moments of crisis that this good man would fight for her, that he would risk everything, his ranch, his safety, even his daughter's security, rather than let Cade take her, and she couldn't let that happen. "I'll go," she said, stepping forward before Gabriel could stop her. The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but she forced them out. "I'll go with you." "Just leave them alone." "Meredith, no." Gabriel turned to look at her, his eyes blazing with something that might have been panic. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." She tried to keep her voice steady, tried to hide the terror that was clawing at her throat. "It's what the law says, isn't it? I belong to him." Cade's laugh was triumphant now. "Smart girl. Knows when she's beat. Come on then, get your things. We got a long ride ahead of us." But as Meredith started toward the house, Annabelle broke free from the doorway and ran to her, small arms wrapping around her waist with desperate strength. "No!" the child sobbed. "You can't go. You can't leave us." The sound of Annabelle's crying broke something inside Meredith's chest. This little girl, who had already lost her mother, was about to lose the closest thing to a mother she had found since. The injustice of it, the cruel randomness that destroyed good things while evil flourished, made anger bloom bright and hot in Meredith's core. "Let her go, sweetheart," she whispered, kneeling to Annabelle's level. "Everything will be all right." But even as she said the words, she knew they were lies. Nothing would be all right. Cade's eyes promised things that made her skin crawl, and she understood now why her father had been so eager to get rid of her. He had known exactly what kind of man he was selling her to. Gabriel's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steady. "I won't let him take you," he said quietly. "Whatever it costs." "It'll cost you your daughter's safety," Cade interjected, apparently tired of the tender scene. "Maybe more." "Me and my boys, we don't like being kept waiting." Meredith looked up at Gabriel and saw her own fear reflected in his eyes, but also something else, a determination that ran deeper than fear. This man had already lost his wife. He wouldn't lose someone else without a fight. "There has to be another way," she whispered. "Ain't no other way," Cade said, swinging down from his horse with casual confidence. "Girl belongs to me. Contract says so. Now stop wasting my time and get your things." But Gabriel stepped forward, putting himself squarely between Cade and the two people he had apparently decided to protect with his life. "The contract might say that, but the girl says different. And in Montana territory, a woman has the right to refuse a marriage, even if papers have been signed." Cade's expression darkened. "That ain't how it works where I come from." "Well, you're not where you come from," Gabriel replied evenly. "You're on my land, in Montana territory, and the law here says different." For a moment, the two men faced each other in silence, the air thick with the promise of violence. Meredith could feel Annabelle trembling against her, could hear the little girl's muffled sobs, and knew that whatever happened next would change everything. Cade spat in the dust at Gabriel's feet. "You think hiding behind territorial law will save you? I got friends, Rancher. Friends who don't care much for law when it gets in the way of business. And I've got neighbors, Gabriel replied. Good people who don't take kindly to men who threaten children. We'll see about that. Cade swung back up into his saddle, his face twisted with rage and frustration. This ain't over. Girl's mine by right, and I mean to have what's mine. He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. But before they rode away, he called back over his shoulder. You got 3 days to think it over, rancher. 3 days to decide if that girl's worth dying for. The sound of their departure was as violent as their arrival, hooves pounding the earth like war drums. When the dust finally settled, the three of them stood in the sudden silence, holding on to each other as if they could anchor themselves against the storm that was coming. Gabriel's arms came around both of them, strong and protective, and for a moment Meredith allowed herself to believe that love might be enough to keep them safe. But deep in her heart, she knew that Cade wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. He would be back, and next time he wouldn't come alone. What are we going to do? She whispered against Gabriel's chest. We're going to fight, he said simply. All of us together. Annabelle pulled back to look up at both of them, her face streaked with tears, but her jaw set with the same determination she had inherited from her father. He can't have you, she said fiercely. You're ours now. The simple declaration, spoken with such absolute conviction by a 7-year-old child, should have been heartbreaking in its naivety. Instead, it filled Meredith with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. These people had chosen her, had claimed her as family when she had nowhere else to go. Now it was time for her to choose them back, whatever the cost. The ride into town the next morning felt like traveling through a world that had suddenly become hostile. Gabriel kept his rifle across his saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of Cade's men, while Meredith held Annabelle close on the wagon seat beside him. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every distant rider a potential enemy. Gabriel's father's Bible lay wrapped in oiled cloth beneath the wagon seat, a thick, leather-bound volume filled with handwritten notes about marriage, family, and moral guidance that 3 generations of Ashford men had consulted in times of crisis. Gabriel had pulled it from the family chest that morning, running his fingers over his grandfather's faded marginalia about the sanctity of protecting the innocent. We'll see Judge Morrison first, Gabriel said as they approached the outskirts of Willow Creek. He's a fair man, been on the bench for 20 years. If anyone can find a legal way around Cade's claim, it'll be him. The town spread before them like something from a child's storybook. Neat rows of wooden buildings, a white church with a proper steeple, and Main Street bustling with the morning commerce of decent people living ordinary lives. It seemed impossible that violence could touch such a place. But Meredith had learned that evil could flourish anywhere. Judge Morrison's office occupied the 2nd floor of the bank building, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked under their feet. The judge himself was a thin, scholarly man, with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink stains on his fingers. He listened to Gabriel's explanation with the careful attention of someone accustomed to parsing truth from desperate hope. The territorial law is clear, Judge Morrison said finally, setting Cade's marriage contract on his desk like evidence in a trial. A woman cannot be compelled into marriage against her will, regardless of any prior agreements made by her family. Relief flooded through Meredith like cool water. Then I'm free. The judge's expression grew troubled. In the eyes of Montana law, yes. But this Cade fellow, I've heard his name before. He's got connections to some unsavory characters who operate outside the law. They don't much care what territorial statutes say. Gabriel leaned forward in his chair. What do you suggest we do? Legally? File a formal complaint. I'll issue a restraining order forbidding Cade from approaching Miss Meredith. Sheriff Williams can serve it. Judge Morrison removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a careful precision that suggested he was thinking hard, practically. I'd suggest you prepare for trouble. Men like Cade don't accept legal defeats gracefully. They left the judge's office with papers that felt flimsy as autumn leaves against the storm that was coming. Gabriel's next stop was Sheriff Williams. A grizzled man with silver hair and the kind of steady gaze that had kept peace in Willow Creek for 15 years. Sheriff Williams studied the restraining order and shook his head. "I'll serve it, Gabriel, but you know as well as I do that paper won't stop bullets. Cade's the type who settles disputes with lead, not lawyers. How many deputies can you spare?" Gabriel asked. "2, maybe 3 if I pull men from the county patrol. But they can't camp at your ranch permanent-like." "I got responsibilities to the whole territory," Gabriel nodded grimly. "I understand. Do what you can." As they prepared to leave town, Gabriel made one more stop at Murphy's General Store, where he purchased extra ammunition and supplies. Word of their situation had already spread through the small community, the way news travels in places where everyone knows everyone else's business. Mrs. Murphy, a kindly woman who had known Gabriel since he was Annabelle's age, pressed a basket of fresh bread and preserves into Meredith's hands. "You tell that Gabriel he's got friends here," she said firmly. "Good people don't stand by when bullies come calling." Similar offers of support came from other townspeople. The blacksmith promised to loan Gabriel extra weapons. The preacher offered to organize the church men for protection. Even old Doc Henley, who rarely ventured beyond his medical practice, volunteered to ride out to the ranch if his services were needed. The solidarity was overwhelming and deeply moving, but it also highlighted the danger they faced. These good people were willing to risk their own safety for a family they cared about, which meant Meredith's presence was putting the entire community at risk. On the ride home, she voiced this concern to Gabriel. "Maybe I should just leave," she said quietly, so Annabelle couldn't hear over the wagon's rattling. "Go somewhere Cade can't find me. It would be safer for everyone." Gabriel's hands tightened on the reins. "Running won't solve anything. Men like Cade don't give up. They just get meaner. But if I'm not here, if you're not here, Annabelle loses the best thing that's happened to her since her mother died. And I lose." He stopped, his jaw working as he struggled with words. "I lose the first real happiness I've felt in 7 years." The admission hung between them, fragile and precious as spun glass. Meredith felt her heart skip against her ribs, hope and terror warring in her chest. That evening, as if to prove Gabriel's point about the community's support, neighbors began arriving at the ranch. Tom Bradley rode over from the adjoining property, his eldest son in tow, both carrying rifles. The Williamson brothers came from their spread, 5 miles south. Grim-faced men who had fought in the war and knew how to handle trouble. "Heard you might need some extra eyes watching the horizon," Tom said, settling his horse beside Gabriel's porch. "Me and the boy can take first watch." More men arrived as the sun set, a dozen ranchers and their grown sons, forming an impromptu militia that would have made Cade think twice about an easy assault. They posted sentries at strategic points around the ranch, settled in for a long night of vigilance. Meredith prepared coffee and food for the men, moving through the kitchen with nervous energy. The generosity of these neighbors, their willingness to risk themselves for her sake, was humbling and frightening in equal measure. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the life she had lived before coming to Gabriel's ranch. The isolation, the daily struggle just to survive her father's anger and despair. She had never known what it felt like to be protected, to have people willing to stand between her and harm. Late that night, when the sentries had settled into their watches and Annabelle was finally asleep, Gabriel found Meredith sitting by the kitchen window, staring out at the dark prairie. "Can't sleep?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "I keep thinking about what you said, about happiness." She turned to look at him, this good man who had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go. "I've never had that before. Real happiness. I don't know what to do with it." Gabriel reached across the small space between their chairs and took her hand. His calloused fingers were warm and steady, anchoring her to this moment, this feeling of safety and belonging. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said softly. "Just let it be. Let yourself have it, even if it doesn't last. Especially if it doesn't last. Happiness is precious because it's fragile. That doesn't make it less real." Outside, one of the sentries called a quiet all clear to his partner. The sound was reassuring, but Meredith knew it was temporary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. Cade wouldn't be deterred by a few armed neighbors and a piece of paper from a territorial judge. But tonight, surrounded by people who had chosen to protect her, sitting beside a man who looked at her like she was worth fighting for, Meredith allowed herself to feel something she had never dared to feel before, like she might actually deserve the happiness she had found. "Gabriel?" she whispered. "Yes?" "Thank you for everything." He squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for staying." In the distance, a coyote called to the moon, wild and free. Meredith closed her eyes and listened, letting the sound remind her that even in dangerous times, beautiful things endured. 3 days passed in tense quiet, with neighbors taking turns at watch and the normal rhythms of ranch life continuing under the shadow of threat. On the 4th morning, Meredith woke to the sound of Annabelle's labored breathing from the small bed across the room they now shared. The child's face was flushed with fever, her small body trembling beneath the quilts. When Meredith pressed her hand to Annabelle's forehead, the heat nearly burned her palm. "Gabriel!" she called, her voice tight with concern. He appeared in the doorway within seconds, still pulling on his shirt. One look at his daughter's condition had him moving with the swift efficiency of a man accustomed to crisis. "How long has she been like this?" "I just found her this way. She was fine when we went to bed." Meredith was already moving toward the washstand, preparing cool cloths. "Should we send for Doc Henley?" "Tom Bradley's still on watch." "I'll have him ride to town." Gabriel knelt beside his daughter's bed, his large hand gentle on her burning forehead. "Hey there, little bird. Papa's here." Annabelle's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. "Mama?" she whispered, and Gabriel's face went pale. "No, sweetheart. It's Papa. And Meredith's here too." The child's fevered gaze found Meredith, and she reached out with a trembling hand. "Don't go away," she pleaded. "Please don't go away like Mama did." Meredith took the small hand in both of hers, her throat tight with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere, baby girl. I promise." While Gabriel sent Tom Bradley racing toward town, Meredith began the careful work of nursing a sick child. She had done this before, during the years of caring for her father, when his drinking left him weak and shaking. She knew how to bring down fever, how to coax fluids into reluctant patients, how to provide comfort when medicine wasn't enough. Throughout the long day, she never left Annabelle's side. She bathed the child's face with cool water, held her during the worst of the fever dreams, and sang the lullabies her own mother had sung to her years ago. In her apron pocket, she carried the hand-stitched sampler she had been working on during her evenings at the ranch. A simple piece with the words, "Home sweet home," surrounded by carefully embroidered wildflowers. Doc Henley arrived just as the sun was setting, his weathered face grim as he examined his young patient. After what felt like hours, he emerged from the bedroom with cautious optimism. "It's not pneumonia, thank the Lord. Looks like a fever that's been going around the territory. Should break in another day or two, but she'll need careful watching." Gabriel's relief was visible, his shoulders sagging as tension he'd been carrying all day finally released. "What does she need?" "Rest, fluids, and someone who knows how to care for the sick. From what I've seen today, Miss Meredith here has all the skills of a trained nurse." Doc Henley's approving nod made Meredith flush with pride. "Keep doing exactly what you've been doing." As the doctor prepared to leave, he pulled Gabrielle aside. "Word in town is that Cade fellow's been asking questions about your setup out here. Seems he's learned about your neighbors keeping watch. I'd be extra careful if I were you." That night, while Gabriel took his turn standing guard with the other men, Meredith maintained her vigil beside Annabelle's bed. The child's fever had broken near midnight, and she was sleeping more peacefully. But Meredith found herself reluctant to leave her side. She worked on her sampler by lamplight, the familiar motion of needle through fabric soothing her nerves. Each stitch felt like a small act of faith, a declaration that she intended to make this place her home, to become the kind of woman who created beautiful things for the people she loved. Near dawn, Annabelle stirred and opened clear eyes for the first time in 2 days. "Meredith?" "I'm here, sweetheart." "You stayed." The wonder in the child's voice cut straight through Meredith's heart. "I promised I would." Annabel struggled to sit up, and Meredith helped her, propping pillows behind her small back. "Are you really going to be my mama?" The question hung in the quiet room like a prayer waiting to be answered. Meredith looked down at this brave little girl who had already lost one mother and was asking for another with the kind of trust that could break hearts or heal them. "Would you like me to be?" "More than anything." Annabel's voice was still weak from illness, but her conviction was strong. "Papa needs you too, even if he's too scared to say so." Later that morning, as Annabel slept peacefully and Gabriel finally caught a few hours of rest, Meredith found herself standing in the kitchen, contemplating the strange turns her life had taken. 3 weeks ago, she had been a burden her father was desperate to dispose of. Now she was an essential part of a family that was willing to fight for her. The sound of approaching riders sent her heart racing. But these were familiar faces, Mrs. Williamson and her daughter Sarah, along with several other women from town. They came bearing food and offers of help, but Meredith sensed there was more to their visit. "We heard about little Annabel's fever," Mrs. Williamson said, settling her ample frame in Gabriel's kitchen chair. "Thought you might need some feminine support." But as the women talked, their real purpose became clear. They had come to take Meredith's measure, to decide for themselves whether she was worthy of the protection their menfolk were providing. The examination was subtle but thorough. They noted how she moved through Gabriel's kitchen with confidence, how she spoke of Annabel with genuine affection, how she carried herself with quiet dignity despite her unusual circumstances. When Sarah Williamson commented that the house felt more like a home than it had in years, Meredith felt she had passed some crucial test. "That Cade fellow came sniffing around our place yesterday," Mrs. Williamson said as the women prepared to leave. "Asking questions about you, about Gabriel's routines. My husband sent him on his way with a shotgun and some choice words, but he's not giving up easy." The warning chilled Meredith's blood, but it also strengthened her resolve. These people, these good, decent people, were risking their safety to protect her. She couldn't let that sacrifice be in vain. That evening, as Annabel sat up in bed for the first time, eagerly eating the soup Meredith had made, Gabriel found a moment to speak with Meredith privately. "You saved her," he said simply. "Doc Henley said your nursing made the difference. She's a strong child." "She would have been fine regardless," Gabriel shook his head. "It wasn't just the nursing. It was you being here, giving her something to fight for. She was afraid you'd disappear like her mother did. Your presence, your promise to stay, that's what pulled her through." He stepped closer, his hand reaching up to cup her cheek with infinite gentleness. "You've become essential to us, Meredith. Not just helpful, not just convenient, essential. I can't imagine our lives without you anymore." The words she had been afraid to hope for hung in the air between them, precious and terrifying in their honesty. When Gabriel leaned down to kiss her, soft and sweet and full of promise, Meredith felt the last of her walls crumble. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "And I love you," he replied, holding her close. "Both of you, my girls." In the other room, Annabel called out for water, her voice stronger than it had been in days. As Meredith hurried to care for the child she had come to love as her own, she carried with her the warmth of Gabriel's words and the growing certainty that she had found her place in the world. But outside, in the gathering dusk, shadows moved with purpose that promised the peace they had built was about to be tested in ways none of them could imagine. 2 weeks after Annabel's recovery, Meredith woke to a familiar queasiness that sent her stumbling from bed to the wash basin. As she retched quietly, trying not to wake Annabel, a terrible and wonderful realization dawned on her. She was carrying Gabriel's child. The knowledge settled in her chest like a warm coal, equal parts joy and terror. They had only been together as husband and wife in all but name for a few precious weeks, stolen moments of tenderness when Annabel was asleep and the watchmen were posted. Now there would be a baby, another soul depending on their makeshift family's survival. She spent the morning in a daze, mechanically going through the motions of breakfast and chores, while her mind reeled with implications. When Gabriel asked if she was feeling well, she managed to smile and blamed her pallor on a restless night. She needed time to think, to understand what this meant for all of them, before she shared the news. Later that day, as she worked in the garden behind the house, Annabelle brought her an unexpected gift, a handmade doll crafted from scraps of fabric and stuffed with cotton batting. The child had clearly worked on it in secret, her stitches uneven, but made with love. "I made her for you," Annabelle said shyly, pressing the doll into Meredith's hands. "So you'll always have something to remind you that you're wanted here." Meredith's throat tightened as she examined the little doll. It wore a tiny dress made from blue calico, had yellow yarn for hair, and button eyes that seemed to sparkle with life. Every crooked stitch spoke of a child's determination to create something beautiful for someone she loved. "She's perfect," Meredith whispered, pulling Annabelle into a fierce hug. "Absolutely perfect. Do you really like her?" "I wanted to make sure you knew." Annabelle's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "I wanted to make sure you knew you belong with us, forever and always." The innocence of the child's gift, combined with the secret growing in her womb, made Meredith's eyes fill with tears. Here was love in its purest form, untainted by doubt or condition, offered freely by a little girl who had already lost too much. That evening brought troubling news. Sheriff Williams rode out to the ranch with information that made Gabriel's face go hard as stone. "Cade's been busy," the sheriff reported, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that trembled slightly from age. "Filed complaints in 3 different counties claiming you're harboring his property. He's got lawyers now, bought and paid for, working to get territorial judges to overturn Morrison's restraining order." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Can they do that?" "Maybe. Depends on how much money Cade's willing to spend and which judges he can influence. The law's supposed to be the same everywhere, but we both know that ain't always how it works." Meredith felt the walls closing in around their happiness. "What does that mean for us?" Sheriff Williams looked uncomfortable. "Means you might want to think about getting officially married, and soon. A man's wife has more legal protection than his—" He stopped, clearly struggling with the delicate nature of their arrangement. "More protection than his mistress," Meredith finished quietly, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I didn't mean any disrespect, miss. But legally speaking, married women have rights that unmarried women don't, especially when it comes to property disputes." After the sheriff left, Gabriel and Meredith sat in heavy silence, the weight of their situation pressing down like storm clouds. Finally, Gabriel spoke. "We should get married," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "For the legal protection, if nothing else." The words should have filled her with joy, but something in his tone, the practical way he spoke of marriage as a legal maneuver rather than a declaration of love, made her heart sink. "Is that the only reason?" she asked quietly. Gabriel turned to look at her, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "You know it's not. I love you, Meredith. I want you to be my wife, to be Annabelle's mother, to build a life with me that has nothing to do with contracts or legal protection. But I won't lie and say the practical benefits aren't important right now." His honesty was both painful and reassuring. This was Gabriel, straightforward, honorable, incapable of pretty lies, even when they might make things easier. "I need to tell you something," she said, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat belly. "I'm carrying your child." The words hung in the quiet kitchen like a prayer. Gabriel's eyes went wide, then soft with wonder, then fierce with protective determination. "When?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I think maybe 6 weeks along. I'm not certain yet, but all the signs are there." Gabriel reached across the table and took both her hands in his calloused thumbs stroking over her knuckles with infinite gentleness. "A baby," he whispered, as if trying the words on for size. How do you feel about it?" His smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie, transforming his entire face. "I feel like the luckiest man in Montana territory. A wife who loves me, a daughter who adores you, and now another baby to spoil rotten." His expression grew serious. "But it also means we need to be more careful. We're not just protecting ourselves anymore. We're protecting our future." The next morning, Gabriel rode to town to speak with Reverend Patterson about performing their marriage ceremony. He returned with concerning news. Cade had been in Willow Creek the day before, asking pointed questions about the local laws regarding marriage and property rights. "He's not giving up," Gabriel told Meredith as they stood together in the barn, feeding the horses. "If anything, he's getting more determined. Maybe we should leave," Meredith said, though the words felt like swallowing ground glass. "Take Annabelle and go somewhere he can't find us, and abandon everything we've built here. Leave the land that's been in my family for 2 generations. Gabriel's voice held no judgment, but she could hear the pain the suggestion caused him. "Besides, men like Cade don't give up just because you change location. They follow. They hunt." A commotion outside interrupted their conversation, shouts from the men standing watch, followed by the thunder of horses approaching fast. Gabriel's hand was on his rifle before they made it to the barn door, but these weren't Cade's men. Tom Bradley rode into the yard at a gallop, his face grim with urgency. "Gabriel," he called, "you need to see this." He dismounted quickly and pulled a piece of paper from his coat. A handbill printed on cheap paper, the kind used for wanted posters. But this wasn't advertising a reward for capturing a criminal. "Found these posted all over town this morning," Tom said, his voice tight with anger. "Someone's been busy." Meredith's blood turned to ice as she read the words, "Reward, $200 for information leading to the return of stolen property." Girl answers to Meredith, approximately 16 years old, brown hair, taken unlawfully from her legal owner. Contact Vernon Cade at the Cattleman's Hotel. Warning, anyone harboring this property will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The handbill shook in her hands. Cade wasn't just making legal challenges anymore. He was turning her into a hunted fugitive, offering money to anyone willing to betray her location. "He can't do this," she whispered. "I'm not property. I'm a person. We know that," Gabriel said, his arm coming around her shoulders. "But there are people who'll see that reward money and won't care about the legal niceties." Tom Bradley spat in the dirt. "Already heard talk in town. Some folks are saying maybe Cade's got a point, that contracts should be honored regardless of territorial law. Others are standing firm with you, but..." He shrugged helplessly. "But $200 is more money than some people see in a year," Gabriel finished grimly, as if summoned by their conversation. Annabelle appeared in the barn doorway, her face bright with excitement. "Papa, Meredith! Come quick. There's a whole bunch of people coming up the road." Through the barn door, they could see dust clouds approaching from multiple directions. Riders coming from town, from neighboring ranches, from every point of the compass. For a moment, Meredith's heart stopped, thinking Cade had finally assembled his forces for the final assault. But then she recognized faces in the crowd, and her fear transformed into something else entirely. These weren't enemies coming to claim their reward. These were friends coming to make a stand. The riders approaching the ranch weren't an invading force. They were a wedding party. Reverend Patterson rode at the front, his black coat formal despite the dust of travel, followed by what seemed like half the population of Willow Creek. Women carried baskets of food, men brought instruments for music, and children ran alongside the horses with the excitement that comes from any break in routine. Mrs. Murphy climbed down from her wagon with remarkable agility for a woman of her years, her arms full of white fabric that caught the afternoon sunlight. "Heard you two were planning to get married in a hurry," she called out cheerfully. "Figured you might need a proper dress for the occasion." The dress she shook out was simple but beautiful, white cotton with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, the kind of garment a woman might treasure for a lifetime. Behind her, Sarah Williamson produced a veil that had been in her family for 3 generations, while other women brought flowers gathered from their gardens. "We can't let you face whatever's coming without proper celebration first," declared Mrs. Bradley. Her usually stern face softened with maternal warmth. "Love deserves to be honored, especially when it's under threat." Gabriel stood speechless, overwhelmed by the generosity of people who had dropped their own concerns to ensure his happiness. Meredith felt tears threatening as she realized these neighbors, many of whom had been strangers just weeks ago, were willing to risk Cade's anger to give her the wedding she had never dared to dream of having. Annabelle bounced with excitement, clapping her hands as the preparations began around them. "Are you really going to marry Papa today?" she asked Meredith, her eyes shining with joy. "It looks that way, sweetheart. And then you'll really, truly be my mama?" "Really and truly." As the women whisked Meredith away to help her prepare, she caught sight of Gabriel speaking quietly with Reverend Patterson. The two men stood slightly apart from the festivities, their conversation intense and private. When Gabriel returned to the group, his face was grave, despite the celebrations swirling around them. In the bedroom that would soon officially be theirs, the women worked with the efficiency of long practice. They helped Meredith into the borrowed dress, arranged her hair beneath the antique veil, and offered advice about marriage with the warm familiarity of sisters. "That Gabriel's a good man," said Mrs. Williamson, fastening the tiny buttons at the back of the dress. "Lost his way some after Catherine died, but you've brought him back to himself. He was always good to that little girl. But now he's got light in his eyes again," added Mrs. Murphy. "That's what love does. It brings light back to dark places." As they fussed over her appearance, Meredith found herself thinking about Catherine, the woman whose place she was taking. Would Gabriel's first wife have approved of this hurried wedding, this desperate attempt to protect what they had built together? Her answer came in an unexpected form. Mrs. Patterson, the Reverend's wife, approached her with something small and precious in her weathered hands. "This belonged to Catherine," she said softly, holding out a delicate silver locket. "She asked me to keep it safe, said someday it might go to the woman who loved her family after she was gone." Inside the locket was a pressed flower, a wildflower from the Montana prairie, preserved with care. It was such a simple thing, yet it felt like a blessing from the woman who had loved Gabriel first, who had given him the daughter that Meredith now cherished as her own. "She would want you to have it," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Catherine always said love was meant to multiply, not diminish, that there was room in every heart for more than one great love." With trembling fingers, Meredith fastened the locket around her neck, feeling the weight of Catherine's blessing settle against her heart. When she looked in the small mirror Mrs. Bradley had brought, she saw not a frightened girl sold by her father, but a woman about to pledge her love to a good man and claim her place in a family that had chosen her. Outside, the men had arranged chairs in neat rows facing the front porch, transforming the ranch yard into an impromptu chapel. Wildflowers decorated every available surface, and someone had strung lanterns between the trees to provide light as evening approached. Gabriel waited at the makeshift altar, dressed in his best suit, the same one he had worn to Catherine's funeral, though it had been brushed and pressed until it looked new. When he saw Meredith emerge from the house, his face transformed with such joy that several of the watching women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Annabelle walked beside Meredith as they approached the Reverend, her small hand tucked trustingly into Meredith's. The child wore her best dress and a crown of wildflowers that made her look like a fairy tale princess. She had insisted on being part of the ceremony, declaring that if Meredith was going to be her new mama, she should help make it official. Reverend Patterson's voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd as he began the familiar words of the marriage ceremony. But when he reached the part about speaking now or forever holding their peace, a chill ran through the gathering. From the ridge overlooking the ranch, a lone figure sat on horseback, watching the proceedings with obvious interest. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking Vernon Cade's distinctive silhouette. Gabriel's hand tightened on Meredith's, but his voice was steady as he spoke his vows. "I, Gabriel Ashford, take you, Meredith, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, to protect and cherish, from this day forward, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do us part." Meredith's voice trembled only slightly as she repeated the ancient promises. "I, Meredith, take you, Gabriel, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to love and honor, to stand beside through whatever comes. From this day forward, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do us part. When Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, Gabriel's kiss was gentle and reverent, a seal on promises made before God and community. The watching crowd erupted in cheers and applause. But Meredith was aware of the dark. Vigor still observing from the ridge. The celebration that followed was bittersweet. Joyous in the moment, but shadowed by the knowledge that this might be their last peaceful gathering for some time. People ate and danced and offered toasts to the newlyweds. But conversations were punctuated by nervous glances toward the horizon. As the evening wound down and neighbors began the journey back to their own homes, Tom Bradley pulled Gabriel aside one final time. He was watching the whole time, Tom said quietly, nodding toward the ridge where Cade had been stationed. Making note of who was here, who supports you. This isn't over, Gabriel. If anything, it's just beginning. Gabriel nodded grimly. I know, but at least now she's legally my wife. That has to count for something. Later, as they lay together for the first time as husband and wife, Meredith rested her head on Gabriel's chest and listened to the steady rhythm of his heart. Catherine's locket lay warm against her throat, and she could feel the first flutter of new life in her womb. Are you happy? Gabriel asked softly, his fingers stroking through her hair. Happier than I ever dreamed possible, she answered honestly, and more frightened than I've ever been. Good, he said, surprising her. Happy means we have something worth fighting for. Frightened means we understand what we could lose. Together, they'll keep us sharp. Outside their window, sentries maintained their watch, but Meredith knew their vigilance couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, Cade would make his move, and when he did, everything they had built together would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, wrapped in her husband's arms and surrounded by the love of their chosen family, she allowed herself to believe that love might be strong enough to overcome whatever darkness was coming their way. The attack came 3 nights after the wedding, but not in the way anyone expected. Meredith woke to the acrid smell of smoke and the distant sound of cattle lowing in distress. She shook Gabriel awake, her heart already racing with the knowledge that something was terribly wrong. Fire, she whispered urgently. Gabriel, I smell smoke. They dressed quickly and crept through the house to avoid waking Annabelle. Outside, the orange glow on the horizon told its own story. The Williamson Ranch, 5 miles south, was burning. Tom Bradley rode hard into their yard, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim in the firelight. They hit the Williamson place first, he called out. Burned the barn, scattered the cattle. Family safe, but they lost everything they couldn't carry. Gabriel's face was stone as he processed the information. Cade? Who else? But here's the strange part. They didn't hurt anybody. Could have killed the whole family easy enough, but they just burned property and ran off the livestock. Like they were sending a message instead of finishing a fight. The pattern continued over the next week. 3 more ranches were hit in similar fashion. Barns burned, cattle scattered, but no one killed. The attacks seemed designed to spread fear and financial ruin rather than bloodshed, which somehow made them more sinister. Cade was methodically destroying the community that had rallied to protect Meredith, forcing her neighbors to choose between their own survival and continued support for the Ashfords. It was Sheriff Williams who brought the news that changed everything. He arrived at the ranch on a grey morning, his weathered face bearing the kind of expression that warned of catastrophic revelations. Gabriel, he said without preamble, I need you to show me your property deed. The original one your father left you. Gabriel's brow furrowed as he led the sheriff to the wooden chest where important documents were kept. He pulled out the carefully preserved deed, its edges yellow with age, but the writing still clear. Sheriff Williams studied the document with the attention of a man looking for something specific. When he found it, his face went pale. God Almighty, he breathed. Gabriel, do you know what this says about mineral rights? What about them? Father never mentioned anything valuable in the ground. The sheriff pointed to a section of small print that Gabriel had never paid attention to. According to this deed, your family retained all mineral rights to this land. Not just farming and grazing, everything underneath too. What does that matter? There's nothing here but dirt and grass. Sheriff Williams looked up from the deed with eyes full of grim understanding. There is now. Territory survey crew came through last month doing assessments for the railroad. Found silver deposits running right through your property line. And grade ore, worth more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. The words hit Gabriel like a physical blow. Silver? Enough to make you one of the richest men in the territory. Problem is, word's gotten out. Mining companies are already sniffing around, looking to buy claims. And that means... Cade never wanted Meredith for a wife, Gabriel said slowly, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. He wanted the land, the sheriff nodded grimly. That marriage contract wasn't about claiming a bride. It was about getting legal claim to property he knew was valuable. Your wife was just the key to unlock a fortune. Meredith felt the blood drain from her face as the full scope of Cade's deception became clear. My father, she whispered. They threatened him, didn't they? Made him think he had to sell me to save his life, most likely. Men like Cade don't pay fair prices when they can use fear instead. Sheriff Williams folded the deed carefully. Question now is, what are you going to do about it? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. That afternoon, a buggy approached the ranch under a white flag of truce. Vernon Cade sat beside a well-dressed man with the soft hands and calculating eyes of a lawyer. They stopped at the property line and waited, clearly expecting Gabriel to come to them. Instead, Gabriel, Meredith, and several of their neighbors approached on foot, rifles held ready but not yet aimed. The contrast was deliberate, honest working people facing down corruption in expensive clothes. Ashford, Cade called out. Time we had ourselves a civilized conversation. This here's Mr. Hammond, represents some mining interests up in Helena. Got a proposition for you. Hammond stepped down from the buggy with the careful movements of a man unaccustomed to rough ground. Mr. Ashford, I understand there's been some unpleasantness regarding your wife. I'm here to propose a solution that benefits everyone involved. I'm listening, Gabriel said neutrally. My clients are prepared to offer you $50,000 for your mineral rights, plus an additional $20,000 for the surface rights to the land itself. In return, all claims regarding your wife's previous marriage contract would be dropped permanently. The sum was staggering, more money than Gabriel had ever imagined possessing. But Meredith saw the trap immediately. And if we refuse? She asked. Hammond's smile was cold as winter wind. Well, Mrs. Ashford, there are other ways to acquire property. Mining companies have been known to petition territorial government for eminent domain claims, for the greater good, you understand. And if that fails, well, accidents happen in mining country. Cave-ins, equipment failures, unfortunate encounters with claim jumpers. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Gabriel's hand tightened on his rifle, but his voice remained steady. And if we accept your generous offer, you'd be relocated to California, all expenses paid. New identities, new life, enough money to live comfortably forever. Your wife's past difficulties would disappear completely. It was Annabelle who broke the tense silence. The 7-year-old had been standing quietly beside her father, but now she stepped forward with the fearless clarity that children sometimes possess. This is our home, she said firmly. You can't just take people's homes. Cade's laugh was ugly. Child's got spirit. Shame she don't understand how the world really works. That was Gabriel's breaking point. In one fluid motion, he raised his rifle and pointed it directly at Cade's chest. Get off my land, he said quietly. Now! Hammond raised his hands in mock surrender. No need for violence, Mr. Ashford, but consider our offer carefully. You have 48 hours to decide. After that, my clients will pursue other options. As they drove away, Meredith felt the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. Accept the offer, and they would be safe but exiled from everything they loved. Refuse, and face the full power of interests wealthy enough to buy judges, politicians, and enough firepower to take what they wanted by force. That evening, as they sat around their kitchen table discussing options, Tom Bradley brought news that made their situation even more desperate. "Talked to some of the other ranchers today," he reported. "Mining companies been making offers all up and down the valley. Some folks are taking the money and running. Others are digging in to fight, but what?" Tom's face was grim. "But they got children to think about, families to protect. Fighting a mining company isn't like fighting rustlers or claim jumpers. These people got resources we can't match." Gabriel's hand found Meredith's across the table, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "What do you think we should do?" She looked around the kitchen that had become her haven, at the man who had taught her what love felt like, at the child who had claimed her as mother. The hidden deed lay on the table between them, the document that had made them wealthy on paper but marked them for destruction in reality. "I think," she said slowly, "that we need to be smarter than they expect us to be." "What do you mean?" Meredith's mind was racing, pieces of a plan forming even as she spoke. "They expect us to either run or fight. What if we do neither? What if we make them think they've won, while we prepare for something they'll never see coming?" Gabriel's eyes sharpened with understanding. "You want to play dead. I want to play defeated. Let them think we're beaten, demoralized, ready to give up. Meanwhile, we gather evidence of their methods, build alliances they don't know about, and prepare for a fight they won't be expecting." It was risky, more dangerous than simply accepting the money or mounting an open defense. But as they discussed the details, Meredith felt a fierce determination growing in her chest. She had been sold, threatened, and hunted like an animal. Now she was a wife, a mother, and a woman who had found her strength. She would not be driven from her home without a fight they would remember for generations. Outside, the Montana night was full of stars and promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, surrounded by the family she had chosen and who had chosen her, Meredith began planning their survival with the calculating mind of a woman who had learned that sometimes the only way to protect love was to be willing to fight for it with everything you. And the real war was just beginning. Gabriel's military saber hung above the mantelpiece like a reminder of battles fought and won long before Meredith had entered their lives. He had taken it down only once since she'd known him, to clean and oil the blade with the practiced movements of a soldier who understood that weapons require respect and maintenance to serve when needed. Now, as the 48-hour deadline approached, he reached for it again. "I haven't told you much about my time in the cavalry," Gabriel said, his fingers wrapping around the familiar grip. The sword sang softly as he drew it from its scabbard, the steel catching lamplight like captured lightning. "Wasn't proud of some of the things we did in those days. But I learned things about strategy, about reading men's intentions, about surviving when the odds are stacked against you." Meredith watched her husband transform before her eyes. The gentle rancher who had offered her sanctuary was still there, but now she could see the soldier beneath, a man who had commanded troops, who had made life-and-death decisions under fire, who possessed skills that peaceful ranch life had let lie dormant. "You're not the same man they think they're facing," she realized. Gabriel's smile was sharp as the blade in his hands. "No, I'm not." Over the past 2 days, while appearing to agonize over the mining company's ultimatum, they had been quietly executing Meredith's plan. Messages had been sent to ranchers throughout the territory, not just neighbors, but men Gabriel had served with in the cavalry, settlers who owed him favors, people who understood that if mining interests could steal the Ashford Ranch, no one's property was safe. The response had been better than they dared hope. 23 men confirmed coming, Tom Bradley reported as he reviewed the list they'd compiled. "Some I recognize from the war. Hard men, good fighters. Others are ranchers who've had their own run-ins with mining companies. All of them understand what's at stake, but numbers alone wouldn't be enough." Gabriel had spent hours poring over maps of their property, identifying defensive positions, planning fields of fire, calculating how few men might hold off many if they were smart about it. His military training showed in every detail: escape routes marked, supply caches positioned, contingency plans for every possibility. The key is making them come to us on our terms, he explained to the small group of allies who had gathered in their kitchen. They expect either surrender or desperate resistance. We're going to give them something different, a tactical withdrawal that draws them into prepared positions. Meredith had her own preparations to make. While Gabriel planned their military strategy, she focused on protecting what mattered most. Annabelle would be taken to safety at the Patterson Ranch, far enough from the fighting to be secure, but close enough for quick reunion when it was over. The child had protested tearfully, but even at 7 years old she understood that some battles were too dangerous for little girls. "Will you come back?" Annabelle asked for the 100th time, as Meredith packed her few precious belongings. "I will come back," Meredith promised, kneeling to meet her daughter's eyes. "Your papa and I will both come back, and we'll all be together again. Promise." Meredith touched the locket at her throat, Catherine's locket, now her own, and felt the weight of all the promises women had made to children throughout history, knowing that love couldn't always guarantee safe returns. "I promise to fight as hard as I can to come back to you," she said carefully. "And your papa will fight even harder. We love you too much to give up easily." It wasn't the unconditional promise Annabelle wanted, but it was honest, and the child seemed to understand that sometimes honesty was the greatest gift adults could offer. The morning of the deadline brought an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Williams rode up to the ranch alone, his face grave with the weight of unwelcome news. "They're moving faster than expected," he reported. Mining companies brought in armed guards, professional gunmen from back east. Cades assembled a force of maybe 40 men, all well-armed and well-paid. Gabriel absorbed this information with the calm of a commander receiving battlefield intelligence. "What about territorial law? Can't you stop them legally?" Sheriff Williams' laugh was bitter. "Got word this morning that Judge Morrison's been removed from the bench pending an investigation into his qualifications. New judge appointed by territorial governor, man named Hastings, who's never seen Montana, but somehow knows enough to rule in favor of mining interests." The corruption was breathtaking in its scope and speed, but Meredith found herself oddly unsurprised. She had learned early that people with money could buy almost anything, including justice. "So we're on our own," Gabriel said. "Officially, yes. Unofficially." Sheriff Williams pulled a deputy's badge from his pocket and set it on the table. "I'm swearing you in as a temporary deputy. Won't hold up in court later, but it gives you legal authority to defend this property against claim jumpers." It was a thin protection, but Gabriel pinned the badge to his shirt with the solemnity of a man taking an oath. Whatever happened next, they would face it with what law they could claim on their side. As the sun climbed toward noon, the allies Gabriel had summoned began arriving. They came in small groups, dusty men on tired horses who greeted each other with the quiet nods of those who had seen trouble before. Some were former cavalry soldiers who still carried themselves with military bearing. Others were ranchers whose land had been threatened by mining interests in other territories. All of them understood that this fight was about more than one family's claim to their property. Among them was a man Meredith recognized from descriptions but had never met, Colonel James Morrison, Gabriel's former commanding officer, now retired to a small spread near Helena. He was a compact, grizzled man whose authority was unmistakable despite his civilian clothes. "Heard you might need some experienced advice," Morrison said, clasping Gabriel's hand with obvious affection. "Can't let my best sergeant face this alone." The reunion was brief but warm, and Meredith could see how much it meant to Gabriel to have his old commander's support. These men shared bonds forged in combat, understanding that went beyond words. As afternoon moved toward evening, the final preparations were completed. Positions were assigned, signals established, weapons checked and readied. The ranch that had been a haven of peace just days before was now a fortress preparing for siege. Gabriel took Meredith aside as the sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her of their wedding day. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," she admitted. "But not of dying. I'm afraid of losing what we've built together. Of Annabelle growing up without us. Of them winning. Gabriel pulled her close, and she could feel the steady strength that had first drawn her to him. They won't win. Whatever else happens, they won't destroy what we have. How can you be so certain? Because what we have isn't just property they can steal or family they can scatter. It's love, and love doesn't die just because the people who carry it do. Annabelle will remember what we built here, and someday she'll build something even better. The words should have been morbid, but instead they filled Meredith with fierce resolve. She had been a girl without hope when Gabriel found her on his porch. Now she was a woman with everything to fight for. As full darkness settled over the ranch, signals from their sentries confirmed what they had been expecting. Lights were moving on the horizon, men and horses more than they had counted on, approaching with the confidence of those who believed overwhelming force would carry the day. Colonel Morrison checked his pocket watch in the lamplight. They'll probably try to surround us first, wait for dawn to attack. Standard tactic when you've got superior numbers? Gabriel nodded. That gives us the night to make final adjustments to positions. And to say goodbye, Meredith added quietly. They gathered in the kitchen one last time, the men who had chosen to stand with them, the woman who had found her strength, the soldier who had learned to love again. Outside, their enemies prepared for what they believed would be an easy victory. Inside, a family and their chosen allies prepared to prove them wrong. Gabriel raised a cup of coffee in a toast that felt more like a battle cry. To fighting for what matters most. To family, Meredith added, her hand instinctively moving to the life growing within her. To home, Colonel Morrison concluded. They drank to all of it. To love worth fighting for, to land worth bleeding for. To the principle that some things could not be bought or stolen or destroyed by men who confused wealth with worth. Then they blew out the lamps and took their positions, ready to defend everything that mattered with everything they had. The real fight was about to begin. Dawn broke like a gunshot across the Montana prairie, the sun's first rays revealing the scope of the force arrayed against them. 43 men on horseback formed a loose circle around the ranch buildings, their weapons glinting in the early light. At their head, Vernon Cade sat his horse with the satisfaction of a man who believed victory was already assured. From her position in the ranch house, Meredith counted the enemy through gaps in the shuttered windows. Gabriel had been right about their tactics. They had surrounded the property during the night, cutting off escape routes and preparing to squeeze their prey into submission. What Cade couldn't know was that Gabriel had anticipated exactly this approach. The first shot came without warning, shattering the morning stillness like thunder. One of Cade's men had grown impatient and fired at a shadow moving in the barn. The bullet sparked off metal and wood, and suddenly the air was full of smoke and flame as the hay barn erupted in. Controlled fire, but this wasn't an accident or enemy. Action. It was Gabriel's signal. The burning barn had been prepared as a diversion, soaked with lamp oil and rigged to burn fast and bright. As Cade's men turned their attention toward the spectacular blaze, Gabriel's allies emerged from concealed positions throughout the ranch complex. The engagement Gabriel had planned wasn't a desperate last stand. It was a carefully orchestrated ambush. Colonel Morrison's voice carried clear and commanding across the battlefield. Fire at will. Target the leaders first. The disciplined volley that answered his command sent Cade's force reeling. These weren't panicked civilians defending their home. They were experienced fighters executing a battle plan with military precision. Meredith saw 3 of Cade's men go down in the first exchange, including the fool who had fired the opening shot. The rest scrambled for cover, their confidence shattered by the realization that they weren't facing helpless victims. "Meredith!" Gabriel's voice called from somewhere in the smoke. "Stay low and keep watch on the south approach." She pressed her rifle to her shoulder and scanned the area Gabriel had indicated. Her hands were steady despite the chaos around her. All those hours he had spent teaching her to shoot were paying dividends now. When a figure appeared at the edge of her vision, trying to flank their position, her shot took him cleanly from his saddle. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm of advance and retreat. with Cade's superior numbers offset by Gabriel's tactical advantages. The burning barn provided both concealment and confusion, while the ranch buildings had been prepared as interlocking defensive positions that allowed the defenders to support each other while keeping the attackers at bay. But numbers eventually began to tell. Despite their losses, Cade's men were pressing closer to the main house, using their own fallen as cover while they advanced. Meredith could hear bullets splintering the wooden walls around her, coming closer with each volley. "Gabriel," she called out. "They're getting too close!" His response came in the form of action rather than words. From her window, she watched her husband emerge from behind the water trough where he had taken cover. Gabriel's military training evident in every movement as he led a countercharge that drove the attackers back toward the tree line. The sight of him advancing with that cavalry saber gleaming in his hand, followed by Colonel Morrison and half a dozen other determined men, was something that would stay with her forever. This was Gabriel, as she had never seen him. Not the gentle rancher who had offered her sanctuary, but the soldier who had learned to face death without flinching. Cade himself was screaming orders from his position near the ranch gate, his face twisted with rage as he realized his easy victory was turning into a costly fight. "Burn them out!" he roared. "Set fire to everything. I want that deed, and I don't care how many of them die." The escalation sent ice through Meredith's veins. If they started fires around the main house, Gabriel's defensive positions would become death traps. She could see men moving toward the outbuildings with torches, preparing to turn the ranch into an inferno. That was when she made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Loading her rifle with careful precision, Meredith aimed not at the men with torches, but at Vernon Cade himself, the man who had bought her like cattle, who had threatened her family, who was now trying to burn them alive. Sat his horse just within range of her window. She took a deep breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The shot took Cade high in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle and sending his horse bolting in panic. The sight of their leader down sent a ripple of uncertainty through his men, their advance faltering as they tried to determine how badly their employer was hurt. In that moment of confusion, Gabriel pressed his advantage. His battle cry echoed across the ranch yard as he led another charge, this one aimed at breaking the enemy's resolve entirely. The tide of battle was turning, but Meredith could see that the cost was going to be higher than any of them had hoped to pay. The mirror in the ranch house parlor exploded into 1,000 fragments as a stray bullet shattered its surface, sending shards of silvered glass cascading across the floor like fallen stars. Each piece reflected a fragment of the battle raging outside, a glimpse of smoke, a flash of gunfire, a slice of Gabriel's determined face as he fought to protect everything they had built together. Meredith stepped carefully around the broken mirror, knowing that some superstitions were just old wives' tales, but unable to shake the feeling that the shattered glass represented something more than accidental destruction. In the reflection of those scattered pieces, she could see the fragments of the life Cade had tried to break, and somehow, seeing it broken made her realize how strong the whole had been. Gabriel's countercharge had driven Cade's men back beyond the tree line, but the victory was temporary. Even wounded, Cade was rallying his remaining forces for what looked like a final desperate assault. From her window, Meredith could see him propped against a tree, his left arm hanging useless, but his voice still carrying commands to men who were beginning to look uncertain about their cause. "One more push," Cade shouted, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes still burning with greed. $50 bonus to every man who reaches that house. The deed's in there, and once we have it, we're all rich. But something had changed in the dynamic of the fight. Several of Cade's hired guns were looking at their wounded employer with expressions that suggested they were recalculating the odds of success against the certainty of their own mortality. Fighting for money was one thing. Dying for another man's obsession was something else entirely. The moment of doubt gave Gabriel the opening he needed. Instead of waiting for another attack, he made a decision that took everyone by surprise, including Meredith. Stepping out from behind his cover, Gabriel walked into the open space between the house and the tree line, his rifle lowered but ready, his voice carrying clearly across the ranch yard. "Cade," he called out, "this has gone far enough. You've lost good men for nothing. End it now, and the survivors can ride away." The wounded man's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You think I'm giving up when I'm this close? That land is worth millions, Ashford, millions. You think I care about a few dead hired guns when that kind of money's at stake?" "The land isn't going anywhere," Gabriel replied calmly. "But your men are dying for your greed, not their own. Look around, Cade. How many of them are still willing to die so you can get rich?" Meredith could see the truth of Gabriel's words affecting the surviving gunmen. They were professionals, not fanatics, and professionals knew when a job had gone from profitable to suicidal. Several were already edging toward their horses, clearly calculating their chances of reaching safety before their employer noticed their defection. But Cade wasn't finished. With his good hand, he pulled a pistol from his coat and aimed it directly at Gabriel. "Maybe I can't have the land," he snarled, "but I can make sure you don't enjoy it either." Time seemed to slow as Meredith watched the scene unfold from her window. Gabriel stood motionless, either unwilling to break the moment of negotiation or simply accepting that some fights ended with someone dying. Cade's finger tightened on the trigger, and Meredith knew with horrible certainty that her husband was about to die. That was when Annabelle appeared. The 7-year-old had somehow escaped from the Patterson ranch and made her way home through the chaos of battle. She ran into the ranch yard at the exact moment Cade fired, her small voice calling out with desperate love, "Papa!" Gabriel spun toward his daughter's voice, and Cade's bullet took him in the side instead of the chest. He went down hard but alive, while Annabelle kept running toward him with the fearless determination of a child who knew her father needed her, the sight of a little girl racing across a battlefield. To reach her wounded father broke something in the watching men. Even hardened gunfighters had children of their own, and whatever Cade was paying them wasn't worth shooting at a 7-year-old. Colonel Morrison's voice cut through the sudden stillness. "Any man who fires on that child answers to me personally." The threat wasn't necessary. One by one, Cade's remaining men lowered their weapons and began walking toward their horses. The fight had gone out of them, replaced by disgust at what they had almost been part of. Cade himself was screaming threats and curses, but his voice was growing weaker as blood loss took its toll. When Sheriff Williams finally arrived with a proper posse, they found him unconscious, and his surviving men eager to cooperate with territorial law. Meredith reached Gabriel and Annabelle at the same time, her hands shaking as she examined her husband's wound. The bullet had torn through flesh and muscle, but missed anything vital, painful and bloody, but not fatal. "Is it over?" Annabelle asked, her small face streaked with tears and dust. Gabriel pulled both his girls close with his uninjured arm, wincing but smiling despite the pain. "It's over, little bird. We won." As the dust settled and the immediate danger passed, Meredith looked around at the ranch yard, littered with broken glass and bullet holes, at the men who had risked their lives to defend her family, at the home that had survived its greatest test. They had won more than a battle. They had proven that some things were worth fighting for, and that love could triumph over greed when good people stood together. The broken mirror would be replaced, the bullet holes patched, the burn marks painted over. But the strength they had discovered in themselves and each other, that was permanent, that was real. 6 months later, the photographer from Helena finished adjusting his camera and stepped back with the satisfied expression of a craftsman completing important work. "Hold still now," he instructed. "This will just take a moment." Meredith sat in the wooden chair they had moved onto the front porch, her arms cradling the newest member of their family, little Samuel Gabriel Ashford, born on a snowy February morning when the prairie winds sang lullabies around their rebuilt home. Gabriel stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, his other arm around Annabelle, who had insisted on wearing her best dress and the wildflower crown she had made for the occasion. The new family portrait would replace the one that had been damaged during the battle. But this image told a different story than any photograph ever could. These were people who had chosen each other, who had fought for each other, who had built something beautiful from the fragments of broken lives. Perfect, the photographer declared as the flash powder ignited. That should capture the moment beautifully. As he packed his equipment, Meredith reflected on all the moments that had led to this one. The ranch bore few visible scars from the battle that had decided their fate. Gabriel had insisted on repairing every bullet hole, replacing every broken window, restoring the property to its former peaceful beauty. But the real changes were deeper than anything a camera could capture. The silver mine on their property had made them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. But wealth had not changed who they were at their core. Gabriel still rose before dawn to tend the horses, still found his deepest satisfaction in honest work under the vast Montana sky. Meredith still cooked their meals, still tended her garden, still sang lullabies to children who were hers by choice rather than blood. What money had given them was security, the knowledge that no one could threaten their family again, that Annabelle would have every opportunity to grow into the remarkable woman she was destined to become, that baby Samuel would inherit not just wealth but the legacy of parents who had fought for their right to love each other. Vernon Cade had survived, his wounds only to face a territorial judge who was genuinely honest, a rarity that Sheriff Williams had located after the corrupt judge. Hastings was removed for accepting bribes. The evidence against Cade's criminal organization had been overwhelming, and he was currently serving 20 years in the territorial prison. His mining company backers had disappeared like smoke when their illegal methods became public, leaving no trace beyond the money they had already lost. Colonel Morrison had accepted Gabriel's offer to oversee the mining operations, bringing military discipline to an industry known for chaos and exploitation. Under his management, the Ashford mine had become a model for how extraction could be done responsibly, providing good jobs for local men while respecting the land that sustained them all. But perhaps the most satisfying change was the simplest one. On warm evenings, the three of them, now four, still sat on the front porch, watching the sun set over the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. They talked about their days, made plans for tomorrow, and marveled at how far they had traveled from those first frightened moments when Meredith had stood abandoned on this very porch. "Mama," Annabelle said, using the title that had become as natural as breathing. "Tell me again about the day you came to live with us." Meredith smiled as she adjusted baby Samuel in her arms. "Which part of the story do you want to hear? The part about when I asked if you would be our mother, and how you said yes even though you were scared." It had become Annabelle's favorite story, the tale of how their family had been born from a child's simple question and an abandoned girl's desperate hope. Meredith never tired of telling it, because each retelling reminded her of the miracle of belonging somewhere, of being wanted and cherished and fought for. "I wasn't just scared," Meredith said gently. "I was terrified. I didn't know if I would be good enough to be your mama, if I would know how to take care of you and your papa properly." "But you did know," Annabelle insisted, as she always did at this point in the story. "I learned," Meredith corrected. "We all learned together. That's what families do. They figure out how to love each other, one day at a time." Gabriel's hand squeezed her shoulder gently, a reminder of all the days they had figured out together, all the challenges they had faced and overcome. Baby Samuel stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that indicated he would soon be demanding his supper, and Meredith felt the deep contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged. "Mrs. Ashford," the photographer called from his wagon, "the portrait should be ready in about 2 weeks. I'll send it out from Helena as soon as it's developed." "Thank you," she called back, then turned to Gabriel. "What do you think we should do with it?" "Hang it right there in the parlor," he said without hesitation, "where everyone who visits can see what a real family looks like." As the photographer's wagon disappeared down the road toward town, the four of them settled into the comfortable rhythm of evening. Annabelle chattered about her lessons with the new schoolteacher. Gabriel discussed plans for expanding the garden next spring. And baby Samuel dozed peacefully in his mother's arms. The portrait, when it arrived, would show a moment frozen in time, a family posed formally for posterity. But the real portrait was painted in these quiet evenings, in the laughter that filled their home, in the way Annabelle had grown confident and secure, in the way Gabriel smiled these days, like a man who had everything he needed. Meredith had come to this porch as a 16-year-old girl with nothing but fear and a carpet bag full of worn clothes. She remained here now as a woman who understood that the most precious things in life could not be bought or sold, could not be stolen or destroyed by those who confused wealth with worth. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly who she was meant to be. And in a world where such certainties were rare as Montana silver, that was worth more than all the treasure buried beneath their feet.